Well, hello and welcome, rookie card collecting friends. Victor, the rookie card specialist, coming at you today, and we are not going to be talking about rookie cards. Instead, we're going to be talking about what is a vintage card to me. Emphasis on the to me part because there seems to be a wide variety of opinion, and therefore I decided to throw my 2 cents into the ring. In my June article for Hobby News Daily, I wrote an article titled Flagship Product, A Logical Perspective. I wrote about Panini being considered the flagship product for basketball and football. But an interesting thought came to mind in this article, and keep in mind that all of this is inspired by the 4th of July and this article that I wrote and all of that. But I believe we are given so much freedoms that we take things like traditions for granted. In other words, we lose sight of them. Now, I'm not going to go into a deep rabbit hole here, but allow me to say this. Biblically speaking now, we as men are commissioned to pass traditions down, the traditions of our faith, to pass them down from generation to generation. As a matter of fact, over and over again, it reiterates the importance of passing traditions down to our children and our children's children. And so when it comes to the hobby, either our hobby forefathers did a bad job at passing down those traditions down to us, or us younger generation, we did a terrible job at listening and understanding. When it comes to figuring out vintage timelines, there seems to be lots of opinion out there. I've given this topic lots of thought this week, and I've come to the following conclusions. There are two schools of thought. There's either going to be a variable timeline or a fixed timeline. A variable timeline says that vintage cards are capable of changing over time. Cards from the 80s and 90s will eventually become vintage. And some believe that the cards from the 80s and 90s are already considered vintage. So what is the timeline? After so many years, what is considered a vintage card? Does it evolve? Does it move? And I guess nobody really knows because opinions are kind of like all over the place on this one. If I were to use this view, I would prefer the 40-year marker because biblically speaking, that is the terms of what is considered a generation is 40 years. And so that plays a lot into how I view this or how I consider to be what's what. And I'll explain here as we move along. But now let's look at a fixed timeline. A fixed timeline says that vintage cards are immovable. They are stable and they are not subject to change. I believe that the era of production should coincide or intertwine with the generation of that era. It pays homage to the nostalgia and the culture of that day. And some say, well, what happens when all the boomers pass away? Will that not naturally decline the interest in vintage cards? And I say nonsense. There are plenty of people alive today that still enjoy collecting pre-war cards, cards from the 1900s, cards from the 1920s and 30s. And there are plenty of novice collectors today that have interest in vintage cards. To me, this idea or this thought is just 100% nonsense. Now, if you look at things in its totality, you will see that there's people, plenty of people, many people that are interested in cards that are from people who are passed away already. And it just, I guess it all depends on what sphere of influence you're around. Now, if you're predominantly your interest and the people that you associate with are all about the ultra modern and the flipping and investing side of things, then yeah, that's how you're going to view things. That's how you're going to see things. But I think, to me, to say that you got to look at the big picture of what's really going on. So for the fixed timeline, I want to do a little comparison, a little production versus generational comparison. All right, let's start. The first one I'm going to tackle is the pre-war era. And that constitutes the timeline between 1860, which was when officially or unofficially the first sports card was invented, all the way to about 1947. Some may say 1933, but I believe the majority of people will believe that anything prior to 1948, that is the pre-war era. Likewise, to compare, the silent generation or the traditionalist generation is the generation that was born within the production era of pre-war. And I like to look at this fixed timeline in comparison to the generation, because I think the two go hand in hand. The generation of the people that were born within that era and the production era of the sports cards of that day. Next is vintage, which is probably the most highly debated era of them all. And not so much when it started, but when it ended. For me, my view is vintage is between 1948 to 1980. In 1980 is when Topps lost the lawsuit to Fleer, and that opened up the floodgates to Fleer and Donruss and many others, and it was basically the dawn of a new era. And I think that is the historical text of everything going on, is an important part of the equation. Now, the vintage card era is typically for the boomer generation. This is folks that were born between 1946 and 1964. And there can be slight crossover in all of this as far as years. It's give or take a year or two here and there. And so I like the timeline of 1980 for vintage, because it was just a massive change within the industry. And even, within a year or two, we started to see changes in the other sports as well. And that whole timeline there of the early 80s just kind of works well with many of the sports. The next era of production is called the junk wax era, which is a term that I really cannot stand. That's how come I have renamed it the mass produced era. This is basically cards that were made between 1981 and 1991. Again, this is how I view things, guys. I'm not saying that this is the way it is. This is how it is. This is just how I'm viewing things. I think all of us can benefit from doing our own homework and creating our own timeline and our own systems as to why we believe the way we believe. But I enjoy the mass-produced era, and it's basically for those who are the Generation Xers, right? They are people that were born between 1965 and 1980. Now, if you add, 5 to 10 years, if you were born in 1970, like I was, and you add 10 years, then you're going to fall within that wheelhouse of collecting. And that was my era there in the 1980s. I do believe that the 1980s is going to have a resurgence in the future. It may be considered, the new vintage or ultra vintage or something. I don't know. But I do believe, when you do comparisons to population reports, the population reports for the 1980s used to seem really, really high. But when you look at the pop reports from then and you look at the pop reports from ultra modern, there doesn't seem to be many cards. The population reports seem very small in the 1980s. And there's a really big shift happening there, in my opinion. And I say all of that to say this, is that in less than 10 years, these cards from the 1980s are going to be 50 years old. Think about that. That's pretty old. So what is a vintage card? Is it a card that's 50 years old? Is it 60, 70? That's what we're kind of thinking things through, right? Then we move on to an era that I have called the insert card era. This is cards that were produced between 1992 and 2005. These are cards. This is 1992 is when parallels came in, insert cards came in, and the insert card really was a very popular era within the hobby. I was a card dealer in this era, and so I know the value and the importance and the popularity that was insert cards of the 1990s. And this is basically right for the millennials. The millennials were born between 1981 and 1996. So you can understand to see the popularity of the 90s. If somebody was born in 1985 and say they started collecting in 1995, so we're adding 10 years. So now they enter the hobby 10 years old, and what do they see? And what do they, when they start opening packs and doing whatever, they start, it's the insert card chase. That's what it was all about. And this is how come there is such a resurgence of 90s inserts, because these millennials are now becoming of age. They have now become established in their careers, and they have the discretionary income to really dig back into their nostalgia, right? Into their years. And see, this is how come it's all of us have that era that we glean to. And I think all of that needs to be taken into consideration when we're trying to define or figure out what's most important. Next up, I have called the Reformation era. The Reformation era is cards that were produced between 2006 and 2016. And this is basically the Gen Z generation. Now, Gen Zers, they were born between 1997 and 2010, 2012, somewhere in there. By its very definition, the word Reformation means the correction of abuses and bad practices. And that's what we had here in this era. We had the 2006, we had PA stepping in and giving the industry regulations as far as rookie card use. We also have the era between 2007 and 2009, kind of a really dark time of the hobby where you had Panini now coming in with a license. You had tons of products going out of business or being discontinued, and you had all of these changes happening. And then there's the licensing wars between 2009 and 2015, where everybody was battling for position on what license they were going to own, and everyone ended up owning their own license and going to their own sandbox and playing in their toys by themselves, and everybody kind of segregated. And that's how come I call this era between 2006 to 2016 the Reformation era. And lastly, we have the 2017 to present, which I consider to be the slab era. This is basically Generation Alpha. This is for folks that were born between 2010 to present day. The slab era boom equates to anything and everything getting graded, especially when it comes to rookie cards. And we also had many novice collectors or returning collectors come back into the hobby, and the emphasis is all about value. The emphasis is all about making money and flipping and investing. And in order for you to be successful in flipping and investing, you have to have slabbed cards, because slab cards increase the value. And so that's how come I think, for my understanding, I really enjoy the breakdown of this era, because I think overall, all encompassing, it makes a lot of sense. So overall, what do I think? I think you should consider subscribing, and at the very least, tapping that like button. But my stance is on the fixed timeline. That's the one that I prefer. To me, vintage refers to the era of production. And that is, I will repeat that because that's the important part for me, is that vintage refers to the era of production. Now, some may say, how about a car? You can title a car to be vintage and get the license plate fixed. If a car is only 20 years old, it's considered vintage. I did a little bit of research on that, and that is not entirely the case. Check this out. A vintage car is a car that was manufactured between 1919 and 1930. Only in that window, in that era of production, can a car be titled vintage. Next category or classification is an antique car. An antique car is any car manufactured between 1931 and 1975. In other words, 45 years old or later. And the last classification of car is a classic vehicle. And this vehicle is manufactured in the 1990s, or the car has to be 20 years or older. So you see, even in vehicles, what is taken into most consideration is the era of production. So taking all of this into consideration, what say you? Are you on team variable or are you on team fixed? Let me know in the comments down below, and please let me know your reason why. With all that said, I really appreciate you tuning in. And remember, my friends, that not all rookie cards are created equal.
The true Jordan rookie from 1985.
Bullshit.
Until next time, buenos nachos, muchachos.